Hello, and welcome to episode 89 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, man.
Good.
But not as good as you because you were out of town in Mexico.
I was. I guess I'm doing great. I made it home alive. So I'd say some people probably lost that bet.
I consider it a victory that you made it out.
Yeah, organs intact, mostly.
I never know what you're going to do when you go to another country. So it doesn't matter whether it's Mexico or the UK or Spain or wherever it might be.
Yeah, there was a pretty high-risk Cuba trip once upon a time, but
there was that too.
We'll save that for the next podcast. Speaking of Mexico, I have yet to stop drinking, so let's talk about it. I've got a cold Dos Equis. What are you having?
That's a good beer. I do not have a Dos Equis. I am actually having a Washington Apple, which is typically given as a shot, and I think it's a very good shot. It's one of like my remote go-tos when somebody's like, you must take a shot, because I do not drink like straight whiskey, and I don't do tequila anymore. I used to. Those were fun times. But I've given that practice up. It's just so brutal. But Washington Apple is usually like 6th or 7th on that list.
Well, there you go. What's in it? Explain to our listeners exactly what you've made.
Usually you make it with like Crown Royal.
Mm-hmm.
So a decent Canadian whiskey. Then you put apple schnapps of some sort. You know, it's like the De Kuyper sour apple, I think is what's in this. And then cranberry juice to kind of like your taste. And then in this case, you just pour it over rocks. So here you go. You can kind of hear it there. It's actually a fairly sizable glass.
Yeah, I heard the rattle. Probably a little sweet for my tastes, but you do you.
I'm always a little sweet. You're more sour than me, so we're all good.
I think that's fair. I'd like to think I'm sweet enough, but probably not. I guess in line with that, you have chosen a really interesting song for today, so I'll let you explain it, but I like this tune.
I actually have, and this is why I'm having the Washington Apple. We have chosen the song. It's by an artist whose name is Nic D, and the song is Fine Apple. And the funny thing about this is that I heard it well before it hit the radio because, Jon, this is a song that has been written and recorded and performed by the son of a very good friend of both of ours.
Mm-hmm.
Guy named Brian Donovan, and his wife Maria used to work here at PowerScore, and her sister Vicky still does work here.
That's right.
And so it's kind of like a family affair. And I've met Nick before, I think once or twice, but I can tell you that Brian, who is someone I consider a very close friend and one of the funnest guys that you could ever hang out with, he was really excited when it started taking off on the radio. And my wife and daughter were in the car, and they were waiting for the premiere of BTS's new song, Butter, because my daughter is a major BTS fan. And the song that came on right before the world premiere was Nic D's Fine Apple.
It's Nick, N-I-C, not N-I-C-K, for anyone who wants to look this up, and we'll put a link to it. It's catchy.
Yeah, it's a really good song by him, and I was like, Donovan's son did this? That's impressive. But Donovan's got a great amount of music talent, and his son clearly does as well, and it was just kind of cool, and we definitely like to promote our friends here. So if you haven't had a chance, go listen to that song. It was obviously good enough to be played right before BTS's big premiere, which obviously is a smash hit already.
That's a cool family connection, man. I'm glad you tracked it down and put it up here. Well done.
I didn't have to track it down. Donovan sent it to me about 25 times.
Okay. Well, then credit to him. What's going on in the LSAT world?
Jon, there's a lot going on in the LSAT world.
It does feel that way, doesn't it?
It sure does. Let's first talk about seminars, or really webinars these days. We always like to talk about the seminars that we're doing, and there are 2 of them this week. If you get a chance, there is one that is coming up on the day this podcast will be released. That is going to be the 21st of July. Mm-hmm. And that's the LSAT 101 for the new LSAT. So that's the new format of 3 sections plus the experimental. So we'll cover the basics there. And then the other one, and really a large part of the reason that we're mentioning this, is that, Jon, you and I will take the microphone live.
That's right.
Next Sunday night for one night only, July 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us, because you will never get the chance to hear this again unless you are a PowerScore student. But we're going to do the Crystal Ball for the August LSAT, and probably for the following test as well, which is the October LSAT. Mm-hmm. We'll have to see how that works out ultimately.
Yeah, these things tend to be a little bit off the cuff depending on developments that occur. So we learn various things as these different tests occur and happen, and we get feedback from people. And that often determines when or if we'll do future crystal balls. But I know for the August test, this is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, when we did the last crystal ball, we said, okay, it's for June
That's right.
and August and really through the rest of the year, unless situation dictates that we should do differently. And then, as many people would recall, we got one of the tests correct from a prediction standpoint. And really, I think getting any test right is a monumental achievement. So I was pretty happy about that. And when that occurred, to us at least, that changed the dynamic of what was going on with August, because that's one of the big options that's been removed. And at that point, I think you and I looked at each other and said, we're going to have to do this for August as well. And so depending on what happens for August, we'll make a determination on October.
Exactly.
But we do it when we think we have something to say that is useful to students. So if you are taking that August test, I strongly recommend that you join us. As we've said before, and as we did for June, this is free to the public. Anybody who wants to attend, whether you're one of our students directly or not, you are welcome to be there. However, we will not post it publicly thereafter, and we will ask the people who are attending not to summarize it, in part because the summaries that I see of things that we've said, Jon, often miss the mark or have incorrect information. And so I don't want anyone to get a bad impression of it. We'd much rather have you be there. If you are one of our students in a course or what have you, we will post it inside your online student centers. And I think that's a fair deal. Free to everybody the first time, and then you have to be a student if you want it thereafter. And that goes for our analytics program as well.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. These things are always really well attended. It should be fun. They're certainly lively events, and I think this will be no exception.
Yeah, we'll keep it fast-paced. And then we'll take questions at the end because, once I start talking, I want to keep talking.
That is true. The open Q&A at the end is usually one of the most fun parts. So
yes, because I'll usually take questions about just about anything.
Mm-hmm.
People very rarely go off script. They keep it to the LSAT, so I haven't seen anything too wild come in yet. But we'll see what happens.
We shall see.
A couple of LSAT developments as well. LSAC has been active in the last week or so. One of the things they did is that they have expanded their fee waiver program. So the limits that used to exist there, they've loosened those a little bit. They've created kind of a new tier of availability. And if you qualify, the limits in terms of like income and so forth are a little bit higher. You don't get quite as much as the full-fledged fee waiver, but you still get quite a lot. You can take a test. You get a couple of score reports for free. I think it's 3 overall. You get Prep Plus and so forth. So it is a pretty good deal, and I strongly recommend that if you qualify for either of the tiers that they have, that you apply and take advantage of it. There's no harm, there's no downside, and it's all benefit, and you should save the money if you possibly can.
Yeah, I was happy to see this. Essentially what it does is potentially include people who wouldn't have qualified under the old tier into a new tier that's not quite as generous as the only one they had before, but it's better than nothing. So this is great. I was happy to see it.
It's a feel-good thing, and having talked to the folks at LSAC about it, they feel quite good about it, and rightfully so. So I'll give them the kudos there that is deserved, and we'll go on to something else that they're doing that I think you and I both view as a positive as well.
Yeah, more kudos for LSAC coming, which is they have announced, although albeit a bit vaguely, that they're going to release a new test. A 4-section test, as I understand it, is going to include the experimental, so the 3+1. As far as I have seen as of this recording, I don't know the time frame, nor do I know exactly which test it's going to be, but there is new content coming soon, and that's exciting.
Yeah, the announcement that they made had a bunch of information in it, and I saw some confusion on Reddit over this. I think some of the licensees who got the information weren't entirely clear. They talked about PDFs, for example, and I know that LSAC does not want PDFs in the public domain. And so the initial thing was, you can use PDFs. But what they were saying was, we're going to give PDFs of the test to the licensees, meaning typically the test prep companies. And they haven't been doing that recently. And in fact, they didn't have PDFs of many of the early tests, which I have always very, very strongly suspected is why Prep Plus didn't actually include those exams. They weren't digitized. That's a whole other story, kind of like fables of the LSAT that I could probably tell. But in this particular case, those PDFs are not for test takers. They are actually for the licensees to use so they can convert that information into online formats. But on top of that, in the middle of that announcement, when it really should have been the very first thing, I laugh about sometimes the priorities here. I was like, this thing should be in red and screaming bold headline. They were like, we are going to release a previously unreleased LSAT, and we're going to add the experimental section, as you said. So immediately the question is, which test is it? Is it, say, June 2020? They did not say. It makes a lot of sense for it to be a test from that particular point in time, but maybe they'll pull something from a more recent date, and that way they could say they've released a test every year. So if I was betting on this, and I really wish I could, we should set up an LSAT.
I know, I was thinking the exact same thing. How do we actually bet on it?
We'd be the only one making the odds. We'd be the house on that. I would think that it's 50-50, but I suppose if I was putting my money down, I'd say it's a 2021 test, because that way they have this consistency of every year since, like 1991, we've released tests. Right. However, it also said quite clearly and explicitly, there is no time frame for this release. And of course, everybody immediately started asking, is it going to be for August? Will it be out before August? I need new content. I would, in this case, bet that it won't. But you never can tell. Sometimes they give themselves this extra room simply so there's no pressure, and then they get it done quickly. And so it could be, but I would probably, if I had to put real money on it, I'd probably say it's not until after August. But they know that that test is coming, so it's not outside the bounds of possibility.
Yeah, certainly the sooner the better. But I'm with you. If I had to lay a wager on this, I would guess post-August, not pre.
It's better late, than early in terms of relying upon them. And it's just, again, they have to digitize it, they have to clear it, they have to vet out all the documents with it, then they have to post it online, which can either be, fast or slow. And better just give yourself extra time. So don't count on it. And if it shows up, then you'll be happy. And quite honestly, with the number of LSATs out there, anybody who tells me, oh, I've done them all and I've completely gotten all the value out of them, I'm like, you probably work for us then. So why are you taking the LSAT again? There's always something you can get out of some tests. And if you think to yourself, well, I've done 50 to the present, go back and do the early tests, especially logic games, because you are missing out if you haven't done the logic games from every LSAT. But we've talked about that elsewhere. I'm not going to continue to harp on that. Speaking of LSATs and the August LSAT and whether or not that test will be out, when are the dates for that exam?
Right. So the first day for the August test is Saturday, August 14th. It's also going to run on that Sunday, the 15th. Get a day off, Blessed Monday, and then back to business on Tuesday, the 17th of August.
Yeah, and then later on, I think on Thursday, they'll have the paper and pencil
accommodations later in the week,
Yeah,
those are the three main days, 14, 15, 17.
Those are the three big ones, and then a much smaller group on Thursday. And then if there are problems that are significant or severe, they give you a retake, and that's a week later, which I think would be about the 26th, according to this calendar.
That's exactly right. Your calendar's correct.
Woo, I got something right tonight. And you can sign up for that test earlier than ever before. It's actually July 29th, which, as we mentioned in our last episode, is 16 days before the test instead of 9. That gives you more time to change work schedules, deal with, babysitters, whatever you might actually need to get it to happen. And then we roll right into the following LSAT after that, which is coming up in October. And that's the week of October 9th. So they have not released these dates yet. They just, it's going to be Saturday and Sunday. So that'd be October 9th and 10th. And then I would imagine, given the size of what October is intended to be, probably Tuesday the 12th.
Yeah, I think
and
those
would be the three main dates there.
And again, if tradition holds, Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday has been kind of their go-to. So
that's exactly right. And that also means you'd be able to sign up for that test in terms of like your time and date near the end of September, as you kind of get in there, September 23rd or so.
Yeah, we're reaching the end of the year, though. If you think about it, that's August and October. There's only one left after that.
Dude, we're talking about the future, but it's still July, so let's not talk about the Dave and Jon. It's already going rapidly.
But yeah, so those are the next two big tests. Obviously, August impending.
Well, I think that pretty much covers the LSAT world. Let's get to the main event, which I think to some extent...
Speaking of August, right?
Yeah, speaking of August, one of the things we've been wanting to do recently is talk about some of the basics of how things work, because there's so much misinformation and really misunderstanding out there. And in our last episode, we talked about how the scoring scale really works. And I thought that was an interesting conversation and certainly dispelled a number of myths. Let's do the same thing with the experimental section. And some students who are listening to this might be like, I don't know what that is. So let's open up by talking a little bit about what the experimental section actually is, just from a physical standpoint.
Sure.
You want to take that?
Well, yeah, conversationally, though, I don't want to monologue. But as for history or some background on what the experimental section is, it was, for the longest time, Preflex, one of the 5 sections that appeared from 1991 through 2020 on the test, and sometimes called the variable or the unscored section. And essentially what it was a duplicate or an extra section on your test, same construction as one of the others, but it didn't contribute towards your score. Instead, the purpose of it was for them to use experimental or pre-testing types of questions through a testing audience to vet questions for future exams.
Yeah, so as you look at that variable is what LSAC calls it, unscored sometimes.
Unscored, right.
We call it an experimental section because they are experimenting on you. You are a lab rat.
It's guinea pig,
in this particular sense. And the way that it works, at least now, is that it's going to be one of the 3 types of sections that you had. And so you can kind of go into this knowing that you are about to play a lottery where you've got, would say, roughly a 1 in 3 chance of getting each section type that is out there. And of course, it can occur at any point in the test.
Yeah, so I think this, for some people, especially people new to the LSAT game, this is a bit of alarming news at times. What we're telling you, essentially, is that at least some portion of the work you're going to do on test day will be unrecognizably unscored, but it won't count for or against you. It's just work that you're doing to contribute to their diagnostic, their data set, so they can make better LSATs for future people.
That's exactly right. You are doing the work for the future, and you are serving as that lab rat to check performance, to match things and see exactly how they work. So that is at least how it works from a kind of like a physical standpoint. Let's take a look at, a little bit of the history of this, which sounds boring. The history of the experimental section, I might go to sleep. But it is, I think, a little bit more interesting. And if you were just coming into the LSAT and you've been familiar with the Flex for the last year, you're like, well, what is this? Well, this is a return to the standards of history. And if you go and you look at a whole bunch of standardized tests, what you will find is they need a way to pre-test items. They need to ensure the integrity of the test items and the validity of the test. And giving that to a live fire exercise that is scored is not the right way to do it.
Right.
And so pretty much every test that's out there already has kind of like an experimental section or experimental questions. Jon, I think you could probably list them pretty quick.
Yeah, so the ones that people are probably most familiar with listening to this anyway, say the SAT or the ACT, they have experimental questions or sections built into them. Things, again, that duplicate other scored components of the test but don't count. And the point is they're disguised, so you don't know as you're doing it. The GRE has an entire section that's experimental, either an extra math or an extra verbal. And the GMAT, another test that I know people are familiar with, has experimental questions kind of peppered throughout. But again, none of these things are earmarked or distinguishable as you go through, so you just are, again, you're contributing information to them without realizing when it matters versus when it doesn't.
Yeah, and this will come up again later, but that means that you're not going to be able to know beforehand, so just approach it as if all of it's real and then sort it out afterwards.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is if you look at that history, the use of the experimental on the LSAT goes back to at least 1951. We've got a fairly substantial amount of records about the history and the various item types that they have used. And they have used all sorts of different ones. Like they've tried some crazy things out there. For example, they tried a math section that was experimental. And all the problems had basically two pathways to solution. There's one that long, do it the right way, the math. And then there was like this back door that you could do. If you saw the back door, you could do the problem really quick. And so they'd give you like 22 questions over 20 minutes, and you needed to see the back door on a lot of problems. So you think about the name of that section, insightful reasoning is what they called it. Ooh, did you have the insight to see the math pathway?
Right.
Another one they had was called reference reading. And again, you're not going to see these. It's more kind of like a historical curiosity. In reference reading, they'd give you this lengthy report, too long to read overall, and you'd have to skim it. That was actually the directions, skim it.
Mhm.
And then you had to answer 25 questions in 20 minutes. So there was too much to read. Here you're skimming, and it's like, well, how well can you read in a kind of like a superficial, referential way?
Yeah, think about that, though. 25 questions in 20 minutes. Now you get about 25 questions in 35. So, I mean, that is a blistering pace that was mandated by a section like that.
You can't read it.
You can't.
You've got to skim it. That was literally what the directions said. Skim this and answer the questions. They had another one called artificial language, which is, you've seen these kinds of things on other tests. This was like a rectangle divided into 4 quadrants. And there were signs or it was blank in each one. And you had to figure out the relationship between the 4 quadrants. That was another 22 questions in a half hour. Again, moving fast, trying to see different types of relationships. They called that one artificial language, which, whatever. I don't know about that name.
It was more pattern recognition, as I recall it.
That's how I would have thought it as well. These are just some of the examples of what they've tried over the years. There are others as well that I didn't think were as interesting to talk about. But this is nothing new. What happened, though, is they had experimental sections on this test for decades. And when we hit the flex, they ran into a problem in May of 2020. To have an experimental section on that test would have created a 4th section, and that would have forced a break during the test. And as a new format that they were not at all familiar with or comfortable with, this online at-home testing, they didn't want to allow people to get up and have a break between the sections. And so they went for the choice of saying, let's keep it shorter and not allow a break. Once you start, you stay in the room, you don't leave again. So to do that, they had to eliminate the experimental, and that way they could have one of each section type. Now, as you and I have been saying, really since the middle of last summer, at some point, this is unsustainable. They will run, they will run out of sections to use in the future because they're not pretesting anything right now. They're going to have to do this. And the other point that you and I made, and we were 100% right about this, is that the security issues on this test are not related to people going to the bathroom, somebody leaving the room. That's not the problem. So anything from a security standpoint, the way the test is set up, it kind of combats that. We knew at some point they'd have to reintroduce this, and here it is, and it's coming in August of 2021 here. So in literally less than a month, we will run into this experimental, but this has always been on the test. You just got a year break due to the pandemic. Now it's coming back. So it shouldn't freak anybody out. Right. It should be very clearly understood that this is business as usual. And as long as you walk in knowing that you are going to be tested on one of the 3 types, whether it's logical reasoning, logic games, or reading comprehension, doesn't matter, and it's going to be a full section of that, you should be just fine. So it's the lottery. One of your 4 sections could be anywhere in the order. It's going to be one of the types you're familiar with. It won't count.
Yeah, lottery is a good way to describe it. That's how I've been explaining this to people too. Is look, it's going to happen. It's unavoidable. What you don't know is quite how it's going to appear on test day itself. And we'll talk about some of the myths that surround the placement, the administration of it. But I think as a rough synopsis, that's the way it's worked historically, and that's why it's coming back. And frankly, they need to bring it back. I know a lot of people are going to be bummed to hear this because it means you've got a 4th section that doesn't count. But again, it was unsustainable to avoid this forever.
Yeah, they're going to run. They're already low on tests. Their reuse rate is what's allowing us to make certain predictions and get it right. And to understand more about these tests than I think really we should understand in a given moment. When you have a really, really large test bank that you can pull from, nobody can figure out what you're going to do. And they just couldn't track it all. When your test bank starts getting smaller and smaller, you become more predictable. And in that sense, you don't want to be standardized. You
Right.
want a test that is unpredictable, that is consistent in its standardization of the questions and the scaling, but not predictable in terms of like what is actually going to be on your test. That should not be allowed to happen, but it is happening right now. And so this is going to combat that. And the beauty for them is it's not just, they get to test one type, one logic game section. There's going to be a lot. And so let's get into the details because we've held back a little bit. Let's go through those myths. What's the first myth, Jon?
Well, here's the one that I hear. I don't know if it's the most often, but certainly I hear it with some frequency, is that there's any degree of consistency to how the experimental section is going to work from person to person. So everybody gets the same section, or everybody gets the same type, or even if we both get experimental logic games, they'll be the same. And the reason we classify this as a myth is because that is not true.
Yeah. A lot of times people think, well, I got this game, then you got that game, that, these are the experimental. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
And certainly not on a flex test. It didn't work that way even before the flex. But at this point, you can get anything and someone else can get the same or different. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit later.
Sure.
But it also means that I can get games and you can get reasoning. And someone else can get reading comprehension. And so in that particular sense, it is inconsistent. It's just any one of the three, and it's kind of like a dial spins, and this is the test that you get.
Yeah.
So and we'll talk about order. So let's move on from that point.
Sure. Yeah, point being, it's hugely variable from person to person. To me, if there was one maybe huge misunderstanding about it, it's that people always think it's going to work the same from, case to case. Not the case.
No. Let's talk about the content of it as well, because back in the days where the test was fixed and there was really one form of the test, really kind of like the paper and then the early digital test, what you had was a situation where everybody had the same logic games that was scored, the same reading comp that was scored, the same 2 LRs that were scored, and then they had a fifth section that was one of the other 3 types. And that's where you saw a lot of variation. But you could, students would talk to each other after the test and they'd be like, wait, I had this games and then that game. And another person would be like, well, I had this game too and a completely different game. And it's like, well, the common section proved to them that was the one that was scored. And so people could figure out after the test fairly easily what was real and what was not. And that is no longer the case. And this, again, will have implications that we'll go into in more detail. But what it means is that you can have people who have the same section. It could be the same experimental section. It doesn't have to be the same scored section. That is because the flex allows for so many variations. We've already seen flex tests where, Jon, you and I counted 45, 54 different possible variations that they could have used. Well, now you've got a 4th section in there. And so the multiplication of that, it just extrapolates into the hundreds very quickly.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa, there's a lot of different options, which means that as people are looking at this, just because you had the same section now, if you find another person like, we both had the same logic game section, you cannot determine at that point that it is real. That's brutal.
Yeah.
That is going to make for a real bloodbath after the test when people are often seeking information. I am sure that I'm going to be looking on forums where people are like, yep, that was real. And I'm going to be like, no, it wasn't.
No, we're not so sure. Yeah, I think part of the misunderstanding here is that it used to be fairly consistent. There was far less variability over time. There was a long stretch of time where people would have different experimental sections, but they were always in the same place. So everybody's experimental would be section 1 or section 3. And that really made it easy to identify because you could just ignore that section after the fact, knowing it didn't count. Then they started to move it around, but within the first 3 sections, prior to that break between sections 3 and 4. Then they started to put it into sections 4 and sections 5. And at that point, like you said, I used the word bloodbath. It was something of a free-for-all, though.
You could still make the determination because the other 4 sections, no matter what order they were in, still were the same 4 sections. That's kind of like the pre-pandemic scenario that we had. Everybody still had the same scored 4 sections. And then there was this 5th section floating around of any type in any place. Which is why I've often watched students say, "Oh, I had the same section order as you." And I'm like, it makes me want to bang my head on the desk because I'm like, that's meaningless. In a flex scenario, having the same order means absolutely nothing. You don't know what the content is. It's all about the question type. Yeah, you might have had logic games second, but yours was about libraries. I might have had logic games second, and mine was about gardens.
Right.
Totally different tests. The order is irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, this was difficult already when everyone's 4 scored sections were identical, with the flex and the 3 scored sections being different for each person. I mean, it is just proper mysterious, frankly, to try to determine this.
Yeah, more on that in a few minutes.
Right.
But what that means is you've got a lot of uncertainty. And if you start trying to figure out how to figure this out, which is what we're going to talk about next, you'll quickly discover it is going to be a challenge. I think the post-test situation for August and going forward is going to be one where very few people know what's actually happening. And to some extent, you and I will know a little bit more, but we're going to know less than ever before about what's actually occurring.
Yeah, I can already feel the curtains kind of drawing a bit here.
So let's just recap that first kind of myth. It's not the same section for everybody. There are multiple experimentals for each type. There's going to be multiple logic games experimentals, multiple LR experimentals, multiple RC experimentals. It could be anywhere in your test. LSAC says that the experimental could show up at any point, and that, in fact, it had shown up fifth before. I never met anyone who had the experimental fifth back in the old days, so I'm like, if they did it, it had to be really low. I do believe, though, that on a 4-section test, the chance of somebody having the experimental fourth is much, much higher. And if you think about that, the point that LSAC makes is it's a fairness issue. If it's never the last section, you've reduced this randomization. I can see, oppositional points to that, but it doesn't matter. They're saying that it's possible to be any section, and I wouldn't be surprised if it does occasionally turn out to be the 4th section here.
Yeah, me too.
So any type, anytime. Get ready for the free-for-all. The only thing that you'll be able to say is, you'll be able to know your type. So let's talk about that. Right. Let's figure out the kind of like the next myth and talk about the kind of like the uncertainty surrounding this. The big myth that we always hear, Jon, and people always talk about after the test is, I can tell which section it is during the test.
Right.
Or there is some kind of distinguishable aspect. It's too easy. It's too hard. That informed me during the exam. I knew this was the experimental. And I would probably say this is one of the more common things that I have seen. And there's been a number of instances in the past where people have been like, well, I know section 3 was experimental because that game about the threading looms was just too difficult. Right. And I was forced to tell them, I'm sad to say that was the real section. And they're like, what? That seemed too hard to me. Or I didn't try so hard because I just didn't think it was real. And I'm like, never, ever assume that to be the case.
Yeah. I've told this story before, probably in a podcast, about an old high school friend of mine who committed one of these classic errors of recognition. We ended up taking the test in the same room one day, and I talked to him afterwards as he grumpily kicked rocks through the parking lot en route to his car, because he was under the impression the experimental was always in the first 3. And so he thought his 3rd section, not his 4th, both of which were logic games, his 3rd section definitely didn't count. His 4th section must have. And he was wrong. When we talked about it afterwards, I didn't have experimental games, so I could tell him what they were. And he canceled his test in the room by getting confused, basically making the classic mistake of which one was real and which one wasn't. And he canceled, according to him, what was one of his best tests ever.
Great.
Because, again, he just didn't have the right information. He didn't have the right facts. It all worked out. He ended up at Georgetown and is very successful now. But it was a rough day. And it was based on a misunderstanding of one of these fundamental principles.
This whole conversation, to me, captures the idea of what you don't know can hurt you. Mm-hmm. And to me, understanding things like the scoring scale or the experimental section, this is fundamental.
Yeah.
Like if you're really shooting for the best possible score, you need to know this. And it just as a complete tangent, I don't follow baseball tremendously, but I do. I played for years. And so I do follow it a little bit. And it's kind of like one of the basics of baseball is base running. And base running these days is just so bad. There's constant blunders and errors. And I always look at that and I'm like, you guys are professionals. This is pathetic. You and I are professionals, but the people listening to this who are preparing for the test, they're not professionals. But this is your future. A guy playing baseball already is making a lot of money. So you make a blunder on the base, maybe they chastise you, maybe they send you to remedial base running camp, but you're already set. You're making a lot of money. That's not the case for a lot of people preparing for this test. And so all of a sudden, even though you're not a professional, it really is incumbent upon you to say, I'm going to learn the way this works so that when I walk in, I have absolute command over what is occurring. Because that is going to, I will guarantee you, be comforting at the end of the day. And it's going to make you feel a lot better after the test. So this section, especially from here to the end of the podcast, I think is really helpful in establishing what it is you will be able to know during the test and after the test.
Yeah. The sports analogy I often use are guys picking up stroke penalties on a golf course because they don't know the rules. They mismark the ball, or they don't know when you can take relief from certain things. Same principle, though. What you don't know can hurt you. You have to know the rules. And this is a classic example where not knowing them really can carry some severe consequences.
Most definitely. And I know very few golf rules, so I'm sure I'd be that guy making all sorts of penalties. But again, I'm not trying to even get on the tour because that would be impossible for me.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit then about recognition. You mentioned the one that I think we probably hear the most, which is through some, what they would call, I'm doing air quotes, identifiable bit of weirdness or strangeness or just unusual aspect. People want to immediately assume it's the experimental. And of course, you can't do that. You cannot know that during the test itself.
Yeah, that weird element, like that game was so strange. I never saw anything like it before. That doesn't tell you anything because sometimes there are strange games. Think about that virus game back in September of 2016. People were like, this is weird. There were some people who thought, well, it's experimental. And regrettably, that wasn't the case. A lot of people will say, well, the weirdness tipped me off. The other one, of course, that I alluded to is the difficulty. Sometimes people say, well, this is going to be harder or easier. It was too easy to be real. No, you cannot make that judgment during the exam itself. You just don't know.
Yeah. What I always try to remind people is just how subjective words like easy or hard or weird are. Your weird may not be that strange. It might just be something you're not either aware of or hadn't encountered previously, or you've just forgotten you've seen something similar. It could be fairly normal to the next set of people. So again, if that's your litmus test for the experimental, you're making a huge mistake.
Yeah, if you've never done a circular game or a pattern game and one of those shows up, well, that was weird. But if I've done all of them, I start recognizing elements of it and I'm just like, oh, it's this type of game. Less frequently appearing, but not weird to me. Other than the inherent weirdness in those games.
Yeah. Or I hear it sometimes with question counts and logical reasoning. That section couldn't have been real. There was only one must be true question.
Oh my God.
I've seen sections where that happens.
You just gave me a nightmare. I so remember this. Back in the days of the 5-section test, when the 4 scored sections, I would see again people saying, well, it has to add up to 101. I'm like, you don't know the history here. There's been 100, there's been 102, there's been 99 before. Saying it's usually 101 is accurate, but saying it's always 101 is inaccurate and damaging.
No, that's perfect. With the flex, you're looking at 74 to 76, but if you think there's a set number, you're wrong.
Well, especially with everybody having different section content, there's no way to know. There's nothing set, and that is causing a huge amount of problems.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Should we move on?
Well, yeah, we're talking about identification, but really the error that we're alluding to here is trying to identify it in the moment while you're actually taking the test. You can make some inroads on this, make some identification headway after the test, potentially.
Yeah, so let's talk about this because I think that the best way to put this is that it is easy to narrow down initially, and then it is really difficult to determine, exactly what it's going to be.
Right.
I was trying to think of like a skiing snowboard analogy there. Because I always think of one of them as being easy to get to beginner level, hard to become expert, and the other one is harder to become a beginner, but easier to become an expert.
I've never snowboarded before, so it's hard for me to speak to both, but my understanding of it is it's easier to become a bit functional on 2, but harder to become an expert. Once you're good at snowboarding, though, you can really do some amazing damage out there.
it's harder to get basically good
Yeah.
at snowboarding, but easier to become expert.
That's my
I
understanding.
skateboarded for years, so for me, I'm like, give me a snowboard. It felt like being at home. That's an advantage that not everybody has. But this is kind of like what I feel about this, identification. You can get a really good broad sense of what your experimental is. It's going to be hard to actually lock it down, even though you've narrowed the field. So let's talk about narrowing the field. The first step here is, and the easiest and the happiest moment is that when your test ends, you will know what type of section you had as experimental, because it will be the section that is doubled. That's the easiest way to put it. Your scored test will be 1 logical reasoning, 1 logic games, and 1 reading comprehension. So if you get a second logic games, one of those 2 is experimental. You get a second LR on this test, one of those is experimental. You get a second reading comprehension, you figured it out, one of those 2 is experimental. That's the easy part. That's like, hey, I'm up.
Yeah, you'll know that as soon as it happens.
Yeah, as soon as you hit that second section. And we'll talk about the implications of what that actually means, because there are benefits to understanding, your test mentality as you're kind of going through this.
Right.
But that's the first thing. Now, let's just say you've had a situation where you had 2 logic games. What happens then? Because it becomes a lot more challenging. Can you just figure it out on your own?
Yeah, and this again, I think, is where a lot of these myths become truly problematic, is if all you have is your test information in a vacuum, the best you can say is the type of experimental. You won't know which one, you won't know where it was, you won't know the scored versus unscored content. This is where it becomes something of a community effort, for lack of a better way to put it. This is where you actually need some input from others.
And this is one of the reasons why you would see people talking about this after the test. They would be going into detail about what section they have, because they were actually seeking knowledge about what was experimental. And I can tell you right now that the old days were way easier to do this and to understand it than the new days are going to be. And that's because anybody can have anything that's scored or unscored, and it doesn't have to overlap at all with the next person in line. So, we've seen people talk about the test afterwards for years, and LSAC, I know, has concerns about that, and they're valid. And that's one of the reasons they put down really very stringent guidelines about don't get specific, don't talk about answer choices, don't talk about rules. They know people are going to talk because they're human, and they don't want to drive the conversation underground where things could really be disclosed in a manner that's harmful. So they've kind of like given a nodding allowance to the idea of like, you can give a little bit of information. They don't love it. I know that for a fact. And one of the things that, they're really big on is test security, and rightly so. They don't want people cheating. They don't want people getting an advantage. And as I've said, and you and I've said in the podcast before, the flex very naturally and adroitly counters a lot of those concerns, because you might have logic games on Saturday morning that are about banking, and by Saturday afternoon, someone sits down and they don't have that logic game section. They have a completely different one that's scored. It naturally stops a lot of the concerns over talking about the content of tests.
Right.
But if you've gotten it down to 2 logic games, you're in trouble, because if you're in a vacuum, there is no way to figure this out. You'd have to have other information. So I'm going to speak abstractly here in a theoretical sense.
Okay.
I'm not saying that people should talk to each other about the content of the test or anything like that, but there's no way to figure it out. Now, if we want to start out with somebody who you knew had another test and they didn't have the same experimental section as you, that same type as you,
Right.
that is probably going to be the way a lot of people figure this out. So let's say I had 2 logic games, and one of them was about libraries as a topic, and the other was about generals. So I have libraries in one section, I have a game about generals in a second. And then I've happened to, my friend took the LSAT and had just 1 logic game, and they happened to have that libraries game. Well, they only had 1 section of games, so they know libraries is real. That's a really good indicator at that point that libraries was real for you and that generals was experimental. So that's one way people will be able to piece it together and kind of figure it out. And if you look at that scenario, that means that reading comprehension and logic games for a lot of people will be like, oh, I could figure out what was real and what wasn't. Logical reasoning, because there's so many questions and people don't remember a question about cinnamon or whether it was about seals, that kind of stuff. Logical reasoning always has been the hardest to figure out, will continue to be the hardest to figure out. So if you have a section that is doubled, honestly, you're looking for other people who had a single version and had overlap with you. But on the flex, you're going to have other people who are like, oh, I had only one logic game section. And they're going to be like, I didn't have libraries or generals.
Right, I didn't have any of those.
I had something else entirely. And you're like, you're no help to me.
So that's essentially what would be required to really pin this down, is someone with a different set of experimental types and duplication for one of your two duplicated types.
Yeah. And that's not the highest bar, but that's a much higher bar than it was before.
Yeah, made extra tricky by the fact that they like to repeat topics despite being different actual sections. We see this constantly. How many velociraptor claw questions have we seen in logical reasoning?
Dinosaurs, you can't just use that as the reference. And the way people talk after the test, which is as LSAC wants it and wishes it to continue, is very broad. And if you've got two different reading comprehension sections about some type of author, let's say F. Scott Fitzgerald, that doesn't mean that they're the same exact passage. We have seen that. And if you go back, if you're like, wait a second, that's ridiculous, go back and listen to any of our Flex recaps, especially the last couple, where to us, it seemed like this was intentionally being done to confuse the market. So you've just stated the bar. And of course, we haven't even talked about the fact that after the test, a lot of people, their memory is hazy.
Right.
The experience is very adrenaline rushy, and it happens to flow by like a fast-moving river, and they don't remember certain things. They don't remember the order of games, for one. A lot of times they're like, I don't know what my first game was about. And that's a really natural thing. So you might be talking to somebody who had the same test as you, and they don't even know it, or at least the same scored section that you had, and you're trying to figure it out, and they won't be able to help.
Yeah. Or, again, the same game described 3 different ways by 3 different people. That was about newspapers. No, it was about printing. No, it's about publishing. It's like, oh, God. And all 3 are the same. So, again, this post-test haze is its own problem.
Now, here's the thing that you often hear people talk about, when they're kind of like, they first start thinking about this. All right, we've established what the bar is to actually figure out whether something is real. And how you can't do it on your own. You'd have to have information from elsewhere. A lot of times people think that, well, if I talk to someone else who had the same type of sections, like say 2 logic game sections, that I can talk to them and we can figure it out together if we have overlap. That used to be the case. Mm-hmm. It is no longer the case. So let's talk about why that hellish situation is in play now. We'll use reading comprehension as our example. So let's say you're a test taker and you had 2 reading comps. So right away, you're like, one of them doesn't count. I wonder which one it was. Mm-hmm. One of your sections was about Kafka. Franz Kafka, one of my favorite authors.
Yep.
Crazy dude. He wrote some crazy stories.
And a recent passage topic, by the way, so that's timely.
Yes, indeed. And let's say the other one was about supernovas. There was actually a passage about crab supernovas a while back. Mm-hmm. So, I'm calling on recent history, and I'm not specifically referring to any tests here. Those are just topics I'm interested in. So you've had a section that had Kafka and another had supernovas. Now you start talking to a person, and you discover that they too had Kafka and supernovas.
Yeah.
No way to tell. You won't have any additional information. It's like staring in a mirror. You're not going to get anything out of it. Now, let's just say that other test taker instead had Kafka and a passage about deep sea fishing. So you think to yourself, Kafka's real. And probably the chances are a little bit higher than, say, random, that Kafka is real. But here's the problem. What if Kafka's the experimental section and you both had the experimental section in common? And it turns out, because you can have different scored RC sections, that your supernovas was real and their deep sea fishing passage was real. That is a completely legitimate possibility. So while you might think Kafka is more likely than I thought to be the real section, it is not provable. And this is where the true nightmare begins, Jon. Because common sections between test takers in the past typically meant that it was real. Mm-hmm. That's not proof any longer.
At least a single shared section would have meant that it was real. Yeah, I'm chuckling to myself at the prospect that anyone has tuned into this looking for good news, because boy, have we failed to deliver. This is what you get with a test that doesn't require that two people have the same scored content anymore. It really muddies the water.
And that's where you start to realize that without accounting for section order, there are going to be hundreds of possible test forms here. And this is a serious problem because after the test, there's going to be utter chaos as people try to figure out which sections counted and which sections did not. And I think in a lot of instances, you'll be able to get close to it and be like, I think that's it. But you're going to see people saying, I know for sure. They very rarely will. They'll have to have exactly the information they need, or they might be sitting in our situation, Jon, where we see, hey, we know this was used on a test before that was real.
Right.
And we're able to figure out that, yes, that passage about F. Scott Fitzgerald, in fact, is a real section. And that is not going to be easy. And I think, Jon, for you and I, it is worthwhile for us to talk for a moment about what we often do after these tests and the podcasts that we put out with scale predictions. Because, a lot of people, when we put those out, man, I did the last one on my 10th anniversary.
I know.
People wanted it, and they were like, please put it out. I was like, I said to my wife, all right, look, I know it's our 10th anniversry tonight, but I'm going to go record an LSAT podcast. It's very sexy.
Very sexy.
She was super cool. Yeah, it really set the table. She was super cool about it because that's how she is. And she was like, go right ahead. And we did. And people were like laughing about it.
And there were a lot of online compliments for her
she's the patron saint now. Yeah. She got a chuckle out of that. But our situation is such that you and I have been talking about this for months now since we knew that they were going to do this. We're not sure we can do that podcast. And if we do that podcast, there is no way it'll be comprehensive.
Mm-mm.
It's been a massive struggle and exhausting over the course of 4 to 5 days for us to handle 45 or 54 or even 36 different sections floating around out there. Now we've got to figure out this experimental section and eliminate that from being real. On top of the fact that you're going to be looking at hundreds of test forms, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah.
I really don't believe that it can be done. And you and I have said many times we have more information on a historical database than anyone else does about the people who make this test. We often lean on that heavily when we're looking back to try to figure out what sections came in. That is about to get, it's still usable, but it's no longer figuring out 50 tests. It's figuring out hundreds.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to be overwhelming. And whatever we say about those tests afterwards is probably going to apply to some test takers and not to others. And some people are going to be like, they didn't talk about my test at all. And be like, yeah, we're not going to talk about specific tests. We just can't run it down. It also means that predicting scales, really, really difficult. Almost impossible, certainly impossible for the majority of people.
Well, if you can't be certain of the scored content, it's very hard to assign difficulty to the scored content. And I know I speak for you in this as well. I think the standard we've always set for ourselves is I would rather say less than be wrong. And this is one of those things where it'd be very easy to get it wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Which, frankly, it bums me out. But I think it is important we put this kind of like expectation out there for people.
Yeah, you and I have been talking about it for so long because instantaneously we were like, this is going to be problems.
Yeah.
We're going to give it the old college try when August comes out. We'll look at it, and I'll probably know within the first 4 hours whether it's even going to be remotely feasible. And if it's not, you'll probably start to see us tweeting that it's going to be impossible to predict this. And of course, if I think that it's possible, I'm not going to say anything. Because it could very well be that 8 hours or 16 hours later, I'm like, now it's impossible.
Yeah, Saturday might run really smoothly, and then Sunday comes in and everything goes, pear-shaped. We'll just have to see.
And if that's the case, we'll talk a little bit about Saturday, but it probably, I think your dictum there, which is better to say less than to be wrong, is really important. I don't want to say things that are incorrect and give people misimpressions about their test. Everything we've said in the past, we felt very strongly about. We've also been dealing with a test for the last year where every question that every person had was real.
Mm-hmm.
That's gone. That uncertainty is like a gigantic bomb that has gone off in the middle of this, and it's been just floating down slowly, and it hits in August.
Yeah. I mean, what's the ethos of the 2 podcast episodes, the last one and this? We're sitting here playing Mythbusters for people to have the right information. The last thing we'd want to do is, risk our own credibility in that regard by saying the wrong thing post-August. And
100%.
frankly, it's a real worry. As I
Yeah,
said.
we've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and I'm not sure that people tuning in thought to themselves, "Oh, they're going to tell me it's going to be really hard to predict scoring scales," because people love those, and
Yeah.
I love doing them.
love doing
I know
it.
you enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Now all of a sudden we got to be like, maybe not. We will see when August hits, but I'm not highly confident that it's going to happen. Let's move on from that though, because I think we beat that pretty hard right there.
There you go. Yeah, we John Bonham'd that one. There is a third very related idea to what we just talked about. I think anyone listening to this might potentially get the wrong impression that you and I have maybe negative feelings about the existence of the experimental section. And that to me is probably the third myth we should touch on, is the utility of this. Is it a waste of time? Should it be removed? Is it unfair? I hear that word a lot. And again, the reason we would classify that as a myth is I think it's actually very useful, very necessary, frankly. It does what it's intended to do, and it keeps the test more fair than it would be otherwise, despite the punitive feeling that it has on test day for you.
Yeah, it's utterly necessary. I am not anti the experimental section. This test does not exist without it. You can't make an LSAT that is reliable and is a good indicator of performance as a 1L without having pretest items in an experimental section. So to me, I know the centrality of it. Yeah, what is troublesome is what it does to, something that we enjoy doing, the score predictions and the test recaps. So
does it make our lives more difficult? Yes. Does it feel really tedious to have to do 25% of your test and not have it matter? Yes. Is this a necessary component for the future of the LSAT? Also, yes.
Yeah, and it's one of those things when we talked about the scoring scales, we said that literally they know what you're going to score on this test as a group when you walk in, and the reason is they have given all the questions before in experimental sections.
Yeah, this is
so they already know how you're going to perform. So if you're like, what does that mean? Go back and listen to our last episode because we talk about that in depth. So it's necessary. It keeps things in the future so they can be equated and the test results are consistent. So I'm not against it. I know how important it is. It's one of the necessary conditions for the existence of a test with integrity here.
Yeah. In fact, let me take this one step further. I think you'll join me. Let me see if I can actually put a positive spin on this whole thing, which is, in my opinion, the experimental section can actually do some favors to a test taker, at least in certain circumstances. I'll give one example, which is the placement of it can really help you out. If you're a slow starter and you get experimental section early, it's not going to hurt you, and it gives you an opportunity basically for a free warm-up. If you struggle with endurance and you start to run out of steam and get an experimental section late, again, where your natural weaknesses would occur won't penalize you because you're doing content that doesn't matter at that point. So I've seen it work in both directions and really help people out in both regards.
Yeah, and I love that positive spin on it. That's the first of two major positive spins we'll give to this. That warm-up idea is great. If you get an early experimental, say section 1, it's nice. You may not know it at that time, but you're working in a way where you're starting to speed up and get ready. And as you said, the late section, well, if you get it 4th or maybe even 3rd, what's happening is if you're getting more and more tired, well, you're doing your work on sections that don't count. That's really helpful. Now, that means that random placement of it, as you can see how it can benefit you in different ways there. That becomes a real benefit when you start thinking about the psychology of test takers and test mentality. And this is something that has always existed with the experimental. And it's something that we saw with the 5-section tests for years. And we preached this over and over again. And I'm going to do it again. And what I'm going to say is this. If there's only one thing you take away from this podcast, take this away from it. So when you start off the test, no matter what the section is, you don't know where your doubled section is going to occur, where you're going to get that kind of like second one or what type it is. So let's posit a scenario where you start out and you start off with logic games. Maybe you've got some fear of logic games and you're like, this is not the section I want doubled. But you don't know that yet. You start off with logic games. It doesn't go well. It's just not, you're getting going. Things don't click. You don't like that game. One of the rules didn't make sense and you realize you misdiagrammed something later. A lot of times with, on a flex test, right then and there, that you're like, I'm in trouble. You're behind the 8 ball and the rest of the test usually deteriorates because you're like, well, I know that counts and I know I didn't do well. In an experimental environment where one of those exists, if that happens to you in section 1, stop right there mentally and say to yourself, it was experimental.
Yep.
Just let it go. Be like, that did not count and move forward from there. Now, you'll find out later on whether or not you're right. But what that allows you to do is to wipe the slate clean, because the worst thing that can happen to a test taker from a test mentality standpoint is to have a bad moment early on and then let it affect the rest of their test. I've had many students who would take a test. First section didn't go well. They start getting down. And then later on, they discover, by the time I got to section 3, I saw another logic games, but I'd already done poorly on section 2. Mm-hmm. If they'd wiped the slate clean mentally and been like, experimental. And I like to think of it as a very harsh dismissal, like leave the room, experimental, get out. You just got to get away from you. And you have to think to yourself, it's going to be another real section of the same type later on. Alternatively, I've seen people use this strategy where they're like, I had a terrible first section, but I just said to myself, this is the experimental. And then lo and behold, there it was on section 4. And I felt so uplifted because I was like, I knew it. I just had that feeling. And then they went out and crushed it. So use that information. Bad early section, write it off as the experimental, and then sort it out later on. Just stay positive. Don't let it throw you off psychologically.
Yeah, this is easily my favorite talking point when it comes to this topic. And you're right. This is the takeaway for anyone listening. You make a good point, though. I mean, you've got what could potentially be kind of a get out of jail free pass. You're a hall pass, essentially. One of your sections won't count. If it's an early section and goes badly, it didn't count. Just tell yourself that and move on as though its section never even happened. You've got the rare opportunity here to put a quarter of your test completely out of mind, because a quarter of your test should be. Yeah. You might as well assign it to the section until you know better, to the section that went the worst.
It also means, let's say the first 3 sections went great, and the 4th section was the doubled section, the one where you had 2 of the type, but it didn't go well. Don't freak out.
Same principle, yeah.
Same principle. Hope that it's the experimental. Do the best that you can, but then after the test, try to determine which one was real and which one wasn't. We already talked about it's going to be harder, but still you have to think to yourself, there's hope. Information is helpful, but more so a positive attitude and wiping the slate clean. That get out of jail free card is a very apt analogy here. That's how you have to think about this. And that's one of the most important things to understand about this is don't worry about it in the moment. Keep moving forward. Just assume it didn't count. Stay positive.
Yeah, treat everything as though it's real until you don't want it to be. And then you can convince yourself otherwise.
And later on, if you discover, that was the real section, then you can make decisions based on that.
Yeah.
So don't make a decision in the moment. Make it afterwards.
Exactly, yeah. Just there's no point in getting down about something that may not matter yet. We talked a little bit about determining the experimental afterwards, or at least giving your best effort at it. I suppose the question might exist, Dave, for some listeners as to why it would matter. Obviously, it doesn't count towards your score, but who cares what the 3 real and the 1 unreal were? Why would someone want to even go to the trouble of trying to figure that out after the fact?
Some people wouldn't. Some people would say, hey, I did great on all 4 sections, or, about the same on all 4 sections, and it wouldn't make a difference. That's not normally the case, though. We have seen that when there are 2 sections of the same type, people don't perform consistently. One section will often feel better than the other. And in the old days, you'd see people log on and say things like, please, please, please tell me that the game about the airplanes was real. And then you tell them and they would just be elated. They're like, I felt great about that section. And that's the LSAT casino effect. Mm-hmm. Some sections hit you better than others. even logical reasoning sections, which have all these questions in them, we have talked about the casino effect, where if you're good at conditional reasoning and one of the sections has a ton of it, you probably feel better about it. If the other section has very little of it, you probably don't feel as good about it. And so that's where people start to want to figure it out, is when they feel like, I perform better on one of the two sections. And obviously, they want to know that they've done as well as possible. And so that's why they're actually seeking that information. But if you walk out and you're like, crushed it or felt great about everything, who cares?
Yeah.
Walk away and never come back.
4 for 4. Just put the whole thing out of your mind till the scores drop.
I'm a slammer and I'm out of town.
That's right. That's right. But you're exactly right. That's why people would want to figure it out for some better, more accurate performance analysis type of insight. Or if a cancellation's potentially on the table, you'd really want to know what counted and what didn't.
Yeah, and really this is for that psychology for a lot of people the next 3 weeks, because they want to prepare themselves for what they might see. And if they know that there's something that they can be a little bit more knowledgeable about, it helps them feel better. Yeah, if you've got score preview, who cares?
Or that, yeah.
You let the chips fall where they may, and you're like, won't matter to me at that point. But there's a number of people who aren't in that position, and occasionally they are thinking about canceling. Obviously, law schools look at the high score and focus on that, but still psychologically, some people don't want a lower score. It's just something they cannot accept personally. A mindset, by the way, that I completely understand and support.
Yeah.
If it's going to bother you to have that lower score on there, or you think it's going to impede you from doing better on a future LSAT, yeah, this is where that conversation becomes super important. It's like anything. It's not important at all until it's really, really important.
So there you go. Perfect. So those are the myths, or at least those are the 3 main ones that I had.
I think those are great. I think we covered everything pretty well. I'm comfortable with it. Glad you're back from Mexico, so welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back, frankly.
That was your second trip to Mexico City, and I know you're a big fan.
My third.
Third?
Yeah.
I missed one.
This was the first time I ever made the first flight out. So that was a new beginning.
You have talked often about Mexico City being a cool place. I have never been.
I adore it.
Here it's massive. That's the one thing
enormous.
I know.
Yeah, I adore it, man. There's all sorts of trouble to get into down there, which is just my favorite.
Like losing your phone.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about it.
Or having your phone stolen, really, which was more likely what happened.
Right.
All right. Well, on that note, then, we'll deke out here. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating. And if you have any questions, I am pretty sure that in the next 2 months maximum, we are going to do a mailbag episode. You can send those questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, have a great week. We will talk to you soon.